We interrupt our program to bring you this important message.
Up from the Grave is technically the final book in the Night Huntress series. I should note that there have been novellas and novels released since then. Written by Jeaniene Frost in 2014, I will say that I enjoyed this book very much. But if I'm being honest, I am partial to the first few books in the series. When we first meet back up with my girl Kat, it is not too long after the events of the last book, One Grave at a Time. We suspect that Kat does not have any residual grave magic or mumble magic in her blood. She originally absorbed those powers from drinking the blood of Marie Laveau, the queen of the ghouls. And while Kat can absorb powers of powerful supernatural creatures whom she feeds on, the powers are not permanent. It only lasts a few months at most. We've seen examples of this when she fed on Mankari's blood, Vlad's blood, and of course, with Bone's blood. He is her primary source of sustenance, so she continuously has access to Bone's telepathic powers. But when we meet back up with her, she is in conflict with her uncle Don Williams, who was also her boss during her time recruiting and training soldiers to fight the undead for the US government. Her uncle Don is dead, and at the time of his death, Kat cried so much and so long that her tears were full of blood. Unfortunately, she was full of mumble magic at the time, and shedding blood as someone dies is how they create ghosts. Don being a ghost tethered to this world for all eternity is Kat's doing, although not purposeful. We know all too well that in this world, death is a relative word, and while Don had no plans for life after death, Kat still needs his help. Don suspects that Madigan has harmed his and Kat's old teammates. During her time working for this covert branch of Homeland Security, Kat made friends who became her family. Tate, an ex-Special Forces sergeant who was turned into a vampire by Bones at Don's behest. Dave, who specialized in arms and weapons and once had his throat ripped out during a mission. He died with some vampire blood in his system, and a few months after his death, Bones was able to bring him back as a ghoul. Same old Dave, different diet. And also Juan, whom Kat recruited from prison while doing a 20-year bid, who loved women more than he loved himself, was also turned by Bones. Last but not least was Cooper, the last of them to join the team, but their brother nonetheless. Cooper is the only one of them who is still human, but they are all Bones' people, either raised by his blood or protected by it. With the exception of Cooper, they can all see Don in his non-corporeal form, so it is no surprise that Don goes back and forth to check on them. This most recent time when he goes to check on them, he notices that none of them have traveled to and from the compound in weeks, and because Madigan uses Ghost Be Gone, a remedy of marijuana, garlic, and sage, Don cannot go into the compound to check. Don finds out that they haven't been home in weeks. Their phones go straight to voicemail, and something just is not right. While Don is concerned, he still has apprehension about spilling the beans on Madigan. He feels as though if Madigan had his guys, then they were probably as good as dead. Kat begs her uncle to reveal what he and Madigan were up to when they used to work together. What has he done with her guys? And why does Don think that they are as good as dead? Eventually, they have no choice but to go to Marie Laveau and ask her to use her grave magic to force Don into revealing what he knows. Marie's magic is tied to the grave. She commands ghosts and remnants. Remnants are slivers of the most primal emotions left after someone crosses over, and they feed from energy and pain. Ghosts like Don are drawn to Marie and must obey whatever she commands. So, she commands Don to tell the full story, and it isn't good. They learn that Madigan and Don were partners of sorts. Don ran the operation and was directly responsible for it, the people, and the protection of the public. Meanwhile, he supplied Madigan with all types of specimens and labs, Kat's blood down to her skin cells, MRIs, X-rays, etc. Once Kat started working for them and was able to acquire living ghouls and vampires, his scope of work broadened. Madigan became fixated on trying to combine the genetic codes of all three species. In his experiments, he found that no human cells can incorporate both ghoul and vampire DNA. It was always one or the other, until Cat. Madigan wanted to map and sequence Cat's genetic code to create a safer, synthetic version of both the vampire and the ghoul virus. His goal, to create super soldiers for the US government. Madigan wanted to take things a bit further. He wanted to forcibly breed her so that he can take his genetic experiments further. He wanted to reproduce that same component in Cat's blood that allowed for compatibility between ghoul and vampire DNA. Well, by this time, Cat and Don were getting closer, especially after finding out that Cat's maniac father is Don's maniac brother. He started to approach his prejudice against vampires differently. He began seeing the good in Cat and started realizing that all vampires are not a monolith, regardless of the evil he personally witnessed. Cat was once this way, once consumed by hatred of her kind, but her relationship with Bones taught her to judge people by their actions and not for their species. She feels as though Bones saved her from a life of regret, recriminations, and misery. In order to protect Cat, Don declined to provide any more samples from her. In fact, he even gave Cat the authorization to leave the operation and live her life with Bones, even though he was not technically supposed to. But what Don didn't know was that during Cat's tenure as the government's resident vampire-slaying half-breed, Madigan had his own guy working in Don's medical pathologist lab on the compound. This guy was loyal to Madigan and was getting paid to provide samples to him behind Don's back. There were times where the pathologist would feed her fertility pills, and when she was unconscious from a mission, he would extract her eggs and supply it to Madigan. Unfortunately, most of this is revealed in Marie's presence, meaning that they could not contain the threat of whatever Madigan was doing. In the 1400s, when Joan of Arc's half-vampire, half-human status was made public, it damn near started a war between vampires and ghouls that would have surely devastated both communities. Joan's premature death quelled the fear of what kind of creature she would become if she were to harness all the powers of vampires, while also benefiting from the fact that ghouls were harder to kill. Would she bring about subjugation of the ghoulish race by changing the power dynamic between the two species? These were the questions that were posed again 600 years later when human-vampire hybrid Cat began wreaking havoc in the undead world as the Red Reaper. The only way this would-be uprising was quelled was because Cat changed over to become a full vampire. This satisfied the undead community with the fact that it was no longer possible for Cat to become a vampire-ghoul hybrid. But now, what Apollyon preached about could become reality. What could Madigan be working on down there? What kind of creatures would he make? Could he make? Would this cross-species monster bring about the end of vampires? Bring about the end of Marie's people? All legitimate fears, which was why I couldn't even be mad when Marie gave them 60 days to neutralize the threat of Madigan and everyone involved with whatever experiments he was conducting, including whatever specimen that was found. Or else, Marie would take it to the Vampire Law Guardian Council, and they would neutralize the threat themselves, down to the last office worker and groundskeeper. They would not tolerate humans trying to make super soldiers by trying to merge their DNA. A mass slaughter like the one Marie was threatening would inevitably get the attention of world leaders. But to vampires and ghouls, it did not matter if their existence was revealed. They would wage total war. Casualties be damned if it came down to it. So Cat and Bones understood the urgency of the 60-day deadline. They stake out the compound until they decide that the only way for them to get in is by being detained. All employees, including Madigan, lived on site, so infiltrating it covertly was not an option, since no one seemingly exited or entered the multiple thousand-acre compound. Bones is able to go into a state of stasis, which mimicked death, due to some power he inherited from an ancient vampire. So, after getting attacked by Madigan's men and receiving silver to the heart, he was assumed to be dead. Kat, distraught over Bones' alleged death, let herself be taken, while her best friend Denise shapeshifts into a rat and hide beneath the lumps that is Bones' withering form. Remember, after Denise was branded by a demon with his essence, she got all his powers, abilities, including shapeshifting, near immortality, and his resistance to destruction. After the demon died, these powers and abilities became permanent, and now the only way to dispatch of Denise would be with Demon Bone to the eyes. Nonetheless, Madigan cannot resist but to take the bait. He thinks he's got Kat right where he wants her. When they are wheeling Kat to her cell, Denise jumps out and narrowly avoids being flattened by one of the guards' boots. They think it's a random rat, so they think nothing of it. As they continue to wheel Kat, strangely, she sees a little girl in a cell, but she also sees her guys. She sees Tate, Juan, and Dave looking as though they are starved. Cooper was even worse. He was gaunt and looked as though he was not only starving, but as though he had been. Cooper, who is of African American descent, seemed to appear bluish in color due to being covered in black and blue bruising. Clearly, Madigan has been experimenting on Cooper. They remove Bones' body and put it on ice to be examined, and then they proceed to examine Kat and even begin the process for experimentation. But Madigan's scientists don't get far before all hell breaks loose. Kat uses her abysmal telekinesis skills to remove her head, arm, and leg restraints, and she viciously finishes off the doctor by crushing her larynx. With cameras all over the facility, it isn't before long that alarms are sounded and the soldiers are after Kat. Kat is able to finish off the first round of soldiers with not much damage to her person. Meanwhile, Denise is out of rat form and has taken Bones out of his stasis state by pouring blood down his throat. With Bones awake, Denise shapeshifts into Kat to further confuse the surveillance, the soldiers, and Madigan. She goes in one direction, raising hell, while Bones goes to aid Kat. Using his telekinetic abilities, he opens all cell doors, releasing the prisoners, their guys, to join in the fight. Madigan tries to counter this by using a failsafe, a bomb that would be detonated strategically in certain sections of the underground compound. Unfortunately for Madigan, Bones uses his telekinetic ability to sabotage the incineration machine and redirect the explosion, killing and wounding a lot of Madigan's people in another part of the compound. Madigan, now on the run, has no other options. It's only a matter of time before he is caught by Kat and Bones, which he is. But before they can extract any information from him, such as his new partners or backing, if any, he escapes their wrath by biting into a cyanide pill hidden in his tooth. To try and stop his death, Bones tries to give him some of his blood, but it was not enough, and Madigan dies. They then try to bring him back as a ghoul, which they are able to, but what they brought back was only a shell, incapable of providing pertinent information most times. Once reunited, Tate and the guys are able to reveal what happened to them over the last few weeks. Not only did they reveal that Madigan had experimented on thousands of human subjects, they also revealed that the little girl, Katie, was another test subject of Madigan. She was 7 years old and raised in captivity at the facility, and she had special abilities. Apparently, Katie is the culmination of all of Madigan's experiments. She was a human who also carried ghoul and vampire genetic variations in her blood. She was also trained to dispatch of any threat, vampire, ghoul, or otherwise, with efficiency and effectiveness. And when she got older, Madigan planned to forcibly breed her and create more like her. But she was lost in the chaos of the battle and has now fled and is in hiding. With Katie's impeccable hiding skills, her super strength, speed, and fighting abilities, they could not find her. Katie was a little girl who didn't choose who she was, much like Kat, and it's clear that Kat has no intentions of eliminating her. In fact, Kat decides that she would do anything in her power not to let Katie be sacrificed for the greater good. They just had to find her first. Madigan, still in their custody, is questioned by Dawn, but they don't get much from him, so they finish him off. Luckily for them, They were able to salvage some data and footage from the facility, and they were able to identify someone. At last, they had a name, the name of Madigan's financial backer, a politician who shelled out millions to keep Madigan's operation running after Don shut him down, the former White House Chief of Staff, Richard Trove. Trove, who was Chief of Staff when Don was head of the operation, showed special interest in Madigan and his experiments, and when Don fired Madigan, Trove became Madigan's financial backer. Cat and Bones confront Trove, cornering him in public at a political fundraising event in New York City. When they corner him, they find out that he is a demon, one who absorbs and feeds off of energy, so Bones' telekinesis would be no help here. Trove didn't bother trying to hide his involvement. In fact, he revealed much more about what Madigan was doing. Apparently, Trove's motivation is his hatred for ghouls and vampires alike. Demons were here first, the first apex predators, until vampires and ghouls emerged. Unlike humans, they were not easy to dominate. Demons were nearly driven to extinction, forced to hide for millennia due to vampires and ghouls keeping humans out of their grasp. But there came a time in the 1400s where ghouls and vampires almost annihilated each other. Years later, with the emergence of Cat and modern science, Trove decided that maybe it was time for history to repeat itself. He dropped everything for this, poured money into Madigan's experiments, and it all now came down not just to Cat, but to the little girl in the cell who Trove reveals to Cat is her biological daughter. And now that she would be viewed as an abomination by both ghouls and vampires, the two groups would stop at nothing to not only end Katie, but whoever protected her. Cat was never pregnant, but Katie is her daughter nonetheless. They retrieved over 100 of Cat's eggs without her knowledge. They were all fertilized and implanted in surrogates, but only one survived to term, Katie, and she was most likely conceived with Tate's reproductive cells 7 years ago. During that time, Cat was not the only one who had their specimens in Madigan's hands. Tate had to submit specimens of all kinds during his tenure. They just couldn't attack Trove at the fundraiser, but they certainly wished they had once they found out that the world was now in pandemonium. Turns out, Trove released pages upon pages of status reports detailing Madigan's experiments. Included in all this information were video clips of Katie in her tri-species glory. There were extensive pathology reports under headlines saying, "Vampires among us," or "We are not alone." But it isn't who you think. The Vampire Council, as well as Marie, would undoubtedly be alerted to her existence now that it's gone viral in the media. But luckily for Cat, they found Katie's location with the reluctant help of Marie Laveau's grave magic. They convince her that they will be here to protect her. Cat means every word of her promises to Katie, despite receiving word that the Vampire Council has ruled and they have decided that Katie should be destroyed. Cat made up her mind that despite her traumatic experiences growing up as a hybrid, she would raise Katie to know that her uniqueness was not a problem, that she would never have to fear being accepted by Cat. She would always have Cat by her side. But first, she had to make sure that no one killed her daughter. When they found Katie hidden in an abandoned Detroit neighborhood at the same time as Trove, they faced off with the powerful demon. Using some demon bone that they knew to have on hand in case they encountered Trove again, Cat plunged it into both his eyes, killing the demon, eliminating him as a threat to their races and to Katie. From there, they swap out Katie for Denise and stage a public execution where Denise, in Katie's form, was beheaded by law guardians, who were none the wiser, and with plenty of witnesses in attendance. With Cat's display of genuine fear and grief, the guardians believed that the threat of Katie's existence was extinguished. All Cat and her friends had to do was wait for Denise's head to grow back. With Katie now safe and protected with her mother, they wished their closest friends goodbye. In order to protect Katie, they had to go into hiding for the foreseeable future. With the undead community convinced that Cat was too overcome with grief, it can't explain their disappearance. Cat, Bones, Tate, Don, Justina, and Katie sail off to live a life that was relatively normal and quiet, which they all more than deserved.